Welcome to this week's episode of the Caregivers Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Mark Ropeleski, and you can call me Dr. Mark. We've kicked off Season 3, and today's episode is for family caregivers who feel trapped, not just by caregiving, but by the unfair family dynamics around it. Now, let's face it, no family is perfect, but a lot of families are quite dysfunctional, some wildly so. That's real life. If you're caregiving under guilt, pressure, manipulation, or abuse, and it's costing you your identity, this conversation is going to name what's happening and show you where choice still exists. Amy Vasterling has spent decades studying people and how they lose their inner truth under family and social conditioning and how they reclaim it. She's the author of the book No, and today we're applying her work to caregiving inside dysfunctional family dynamics. The easiest way to support the show is to subscribe wherever you listen. YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. It's totally free and it helps us out tremendously. Leave us a review, a comment, share. Plus, it means you never miss an episode. We appreciate you listening. Welcome to this week's episode of the Caregivers Podcast. I'm so happy to have this week's guest with us, Amy Vasterling. Welcome. You're joining us today as a world traveler, and I believe coming in from Germany. So it's a little bit later in the day here. It's bright and early here in Kingston, Ontario. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
So in the tradition of the podcast, I'd like to just jump right in and ask you, in some families, the moment a caregiver sets a limit, they get framed as selfish or cruel. And it always fascinates me. Why do boundaries get treated like betrayal in those families?
Well, it's generally enmeshment or a situation where there was no defined boundary at all ever. They're boundaryless. And so anything that actually comes off as something that is true gets denied. And that's what makes it really hard for the caregiver or the codependent, is they're constantly in a state of knowing better than, but they're treated like they don't understand. And that's what becomes really quite energy sucking from those relationships, draining.
Especially with the dynamics around caregiving, you could really get pulled backwards. Even if you've made some progress through your life, it's just like a sudden whirlpool that sucks you back down into that sort of tension between what you refer to as the model and the knowing. It's an important part of your thesis in your book, which I really enjoyed reading. And maybe this would be a good time to just tell us a little bit about those operating definitions. What's the model and what's the knowing?
Yeah, well, it's exactly a perfect segue in because it's exactly what you just described. The model is, I define it as the control that we assert to maintain or advance our place in the hierarchy. So if you think about a family dynamic and you have a caregiver, that the one who is ill is probably controlling the situation and saying, you don't love me if you don't come and show up, or you don't love me. There's this, like you say, it's a vortex of bad tension, whereas knowing is something that is a human birthright. When we were a baby, we knew when we were hungry and we cried, and hopefully we had that need met. But when that need goes unmet, such as in the situation in unhealthy relationships, that's where things fall apart. And that's what I came to see is I redefine narcissism not in a psychological way, because that's not my reference point in my background. I came to call it, in my work now, narcissistic social disordering. And I think of it as a needs-based problem. So when we look at it from that positioning, we can step back and say, what are the needs? Well, where we have emotional brokenness, which is what you're describing in this relationship of caregiving in many cases, we can't even arrive at a need until we heal the emotional. So this is a complexity beyond complexities, particularly in a world society, and I do travel a lot, where we aren't very open to embracing people's emotions, particularly for men, but also for women. So the dynamic is complex. I'm going to go back and say something about knowing to take it a little further. Knowing is really inside of us. What we know is evidently true. And I signaled to that a boundaryless family makes it very tricky for the person who knows themselves well. They start to second guess it, and they start to, what I say is, scrap for a shred of love and a sense of belonging in an environment that is falsely providing that.
And it's amazing when the dynamics shift around the call to caregiving, because there's so much dynamic at play, especially in larger families where their gravity may pull one individual to be sort of the highlighted caregiver, and that may unpack vulnerabilities and other dynamics that can create a huge burden on the caregiver. In many families, the assumed caregiver is sort of the least allowed to say no, or the least allowed to say, I need a boundary. I have to set this limit. So my question is, when does reliability actually get construed as or interpreted as consent to caregiving? And how does a person end up carrying what everybody else avoids?
Yeah, well, that's the scapegoat, and that's a dangerous position in a family. But I'm going to move that into expectancy and expectation. That really reliability comes out of when we have an expectation. Perhaps the person who's ill has an expectation that this is how this will go. And we can hear in that very statement, that's a sense of control. They feel out of control. They're ill. They might be scared. They might feel their inner emotional what life is being experienced through inner child parts. So they're operating off of a mixed bag of things. And then you have the caregiver who's trying to be forthright. They're doing the best that they can, but they're dealing with, in a way, a broken system within this person. There's disordering within them. And so they might show up and be, the healthy thing would be to be expectant, that the person who's ill would be expectant of the other person. Something good will come of this. This can work out. But instead, with expectations, that caregiver feels an incredible weight and burden. And if they are the scapegoat in the family, the person who they say, well, they won't do it anyway, they're going to try and overachieve to continue to scrap for that little shred of belonging and a sense of what they think is safety, when indeed that's not a safe environment.
The reverse, I guess, could be true also, right? Is that if they've naturally assumed that role in the family for decades, then they really take a pounding when that added load gets put on their shoulders, when family dynamics naturally has a gravitate to them because it's the sort of established pattern in the family.
That's right. And I think what makes it more complex is when somebody's ill, there are a lot of unknowns. It's, now all of a sudden I need to leave work early because there's this blood test that has to be done. There's this other thing. There are immediate needs in some cases. And I think that that's where this can become a great lesson to pull back, to delegate, to ask for help from neighbors. And that is very hard for somebody who sees themselves as the caregiver or the one who is responsible for that person who's ill.
I can see the call to caregiving as being even more challenging when you've existed as the black sheep in the family, then suddenly you're forced to wear the veil of the guardian angel.
That's right. But still, behind the scenes, because the mode of a scapegoat is the siblings are saying, well, that person is this and that. They're saying negative things because they're projecting their own fears onto that person. They have that, we can feel that energy from siblings or family members. And so there's that burden, plus the intensity of caregiving. I don't think we give it much credit. I mean, it's quite similar to mothering or fathering in the way that, if you're a stay-at-home parent, it's constant. You're up at night with a fever yourself, and the child's sick and needs all of your attention. It's a lot. It can be similar, except for I think the other thing that's challenging in being a caregiver is your person might not be who they used to be. If you're navigating dementia or Alzheimer's or these types of illnesses, that is another piece that becomes really challenging. And you're also wrestling with your own mortality, your own future of, is this going to happen to me? Which adds another level.
The other thing that's come out in other episodes is that when you assume the role of a caregiver for a parent, you kind of hope that through your caring, that parent who's now ill may evolve to be that person you needed all along, but who was never there. And that can go back, way back. So caregivers get handed this sort of script that says a good child sacrifices and stays. Yet when that child, now an adult caregiver, looks back, I mean, they were never offered that kind of care. They weren't treated with the same love that's now expected with them. So how do families use that sort of false moral standard to keep a caregiver at the bedside doing it all? Is it more than scapegoating, or is there more to the story?
Well, I think it depends on the person's need to be needed and their sense of resisting or rejecting abandonment, meaning if they leave the family dynamic or they set a boundary that says, I can't be a part of this, in their mind, because of the conditioning that they've been up against, they might say to themselves, I'm abandoned, instead of I'm leaving this situation, which is the powerful way to look at it. So they are going to stay there and continue that process to have some small sense that they belong. And that's the problem in it, is that they could find other places to be and give their service and find people that have needs that they can match and be fulfilled by it. Whereas, I mean, you know this because this is your podcast, you've heard this many times, but it tends to be the person who's the primary caregiver also can get sick from being the caregiver. And it's no accident when you have that energy bound up and replayed. What you're describing in that scenario that you just described is that person will feel resentful.
I wonder if you're running on chronic stress and family dynamics over decades when you're called to caregive, that cortisol surge and the sustained level and that sort of nervous system activation is just exponentially so much higher at baseline compared to perhaps someone called to caregive where the family dynamics at multiple levels were actually favorable and nurturing over a lifetime.
Yeah, and you pointed it out right there. If you don't feel safe, you're going to be in big trouble when you're helping to care for somebody that's hard for you to love. You think you do, but in truth, it's not really love. It's cathexis, which is obsession. And that leads into this, I need to stay here, otherwise I'll never be lovable, the perpetuation of it.
So you write in your book, spoke in your book about that notion of being a highly sensitive person.
Mm-hmm.
Could you expand on that a little bit more and tell me what a highly sensitive caregiver would be like?
Well, they'd be in a trickier dynamic. The beauty of the highly sensitive person is what's good for the highly sensitive is good for all people. But what's good for all people is not good for the highly sensitive, meaning as a caregiver, a highly sensitive person can see what isn't working and operate to change it so that the system works better for the person who's in receiving the care. And a highly sensitive person, Elaine Aron, her last name is Aron, has written extensively. She's the one that came up with the term. And really highly sensitive people, they say the science is 20 to 30% of the population. I think it's everybody, but I just don't think that we're in touch with it yet. But Elaine would say that our nervous systems as a highly sensitive person are more finely tuned, meaning we might take in much more information in a room, and it's not necessarily empathic, emotional. We might see the pencil dropped on the floor and it was red, not yellow, which is more common. We might notice the subtlety in things because our job as a highly sensitive person is to keep society safe. So we could also be the annoying people who say, climate change is coming in the 1970s. And people say, what? Why are you even talking about that? Because we can see the patterns well advanced of when the things are really hitting mainstream.
So that's different than that situation where you're scanning the room because you're under chronic stress, or like the child who grows up under the influence of the model and then ends up hypervigilant and scanning the whole environment constantly as part of their makeup. This is different from what you're describing.
I feel it is. And it's tricky because I don't know for sure that it is different because I both grew up in trauma and I'm highly sensitive. But what I can say is that Mark, I lost my train. I hope we're cutting this. Say the question
Sure.
again. Forgive me.
So, I mean, let me just gather my thoughts now.
Yeah, you do.
Because it was a moment of flow. Um, so, Amy, what you're describing when you say scanning the room and seeing the color of the pencil on the floor is very different from that hypervigilant scanning that becomes conditioned in us if we've grown up in an unstable or traumatic environment where, in a sort of a cortisol-driven way, we're constantly scanning the environment, looking for safe, unsafe, and that sort of perilous conversation between the two.
Right. The highly
Okay.
sensitive is going to be more calm about it. It's not something they can turn off. It's innate in them to sense and see what's in the room. It might stress them sometimes. The reason being, they can see the pattern of where things head. Like if they see the teacher walk in and she's mad, they might know it's going to be a hard day in the classroom, right? Whereas the other students, even hypervigilant ones, they might not notice that right away. They may. But I do think that the two are a bit different. There's a calmness and a natural knowing in the highly sensitive. And I say for people who have highly sensitive children, the most important thing is that you keep them with their knowing, because if they're separated from what they know is true about themselves, they become a mess. They become, at a very young age, depressed and anxious and can be really challenging because they figure, if I don't get to know myself, what's the point of this? And they can see the patterns so rapidly, they challenge that. And if it's not met with, let's take a look at this, becomes challenging for them to really survive and thrive in that. So for the hypervigilant, that's just another category, I believe, of people who are afraid. Whereas I don't think the highly sensitive are afraid. It's just simply the awareness is there because they're to keep the patterns and see what's happening in society. I say in my book, the highly sensitive are the elephants of our world. The elephants are built to sense and know the water's rising or the earthquake is coming. And they have horns on their faces to trumpet for the animals that are up in the sky. And they have giant legs that pound the earth so the ground animals can feel it and get to the high water or get to high ground to avoid the water rising, or get over here where it's safe from the earthquake. They know. And the highly sensitive are similar. The other thing is a highly sensitive person will self-sacrifice. Highly sensitive people would build a human bridge to get everybody to safety and they drown because that's what they're built to do, is they're built to make sure that everybody survives that can, right? There's this altruistic nature.
Is that almost a version of empathy that's gone toxic?
It could look that way, but that's how it looks in the model. In the society that's gone, I mean, I call it the silent system that we can all feel, but we can't articulate, right? It's challenging to say this is what is really going on with society. But no, I don't think it is a toxic trait in a society that runs how humanity runs, which is based on natural equality and unique expressive expansion. It's a very different world.
That is the hope. A lot of caregivers will be heard saying or thinking, I really love them, but I merely feel like an employee or a staff member. When does caregiving stop actually being loving and becoming something you do not to rock the boat and to just keep your place in the family and just keep the peace?
Well, sadly, I think it's more common to do that. Either for some, it's to show, look at what I did. I take care of my parent who's ill and I do all of these amazing things. It's a way to posture in the model, to show off, to prove who you are. I think for others, it's a heavy situation where they go home and they are torn. One of the postures in the model is withholding, and on the enabler side of that, meaning the person who's more giving and wants to help everybody and not let anybody hurt, that becomes, I leave the caregiving situation where I'm there helping and I ruminate and I recklessly go into thought that I can't set down. And what I've found in clients is the second generation, if they haven't addressed that rumination, which I call it self-abuse, you're not stopping to let that, you don't know. So let it go because you'll never know what's going on there. But the secondary piece that I've seen in clients is their next generation, their children will self-harm unless the parent clinches that and stops that behavior. So it depends on what you do with it if you have healthy outlets to let out, like walking in the woods or deep breathing or, the possibility of meditation or socializing with friends, especially intimate friends that can sit quietly without talking, the likelihood of you being able to restore off of friendships and situations that are positive and powerful for you, that's great. But if you are so bogged down by all of it that there's depression involved or anxiety, and you're not feeling safe at all, it's a recipe for, disaster for them. It's a big burden.
It's the importance of real friends as opposed to deal friends. I can't remember. I can't take credit for that. I'm trying to rack my brain as to where I saw that recently, because I've seen lots of information and thoughts coming across my feed. But the person who said it will know, and I don't take credit for it. And they can DM us to remind us who they are. But I think that really hits home. Are the highly sensitive children who perhaps have not been nurtured the way they needed at particular risk when they become caregivers in the future? Is that like the perfect storm for significant caregiver burnout and that whole cascade of effects that can happen? Is that almost a way of trying to, we had to look at all caregivers and sort of create a boot camp or some sort of thing to say, life is going to change right now. You need to take an inventory of what you've been through because there's something coming. And maybe if we do a bit of work now, that'll be a more graceful passage.
Yeah, I think that it can compound if you had a childhood that was traumatizing as a highly sensitive. That, to me, it hits you at a deeper depth. And so if you're dealing with that and carrying that forward, you're absolutely right. Making the pathway paved with a therapist that you already know so that you can go and get the support you need, or like we talked about, a group of friends, ways that you can have outlets to let it out that are safe. Because I think the main piece that I'm hearing in your question is, if there's not safety, what happens? And there's not safety if there's this dynamic going on of the model or codependency, which the model is pervasive. I've found it everywhere. We're not immune to it.
It's interesting, we've done some work in previous episodes exploring elements of this, but not quite at this level of depth. But when we do post clips about caregiving and the notion of caregivers losing their identity and having to set boundaries if they're going to get through that, we actually get comments saying that, your parents gave you your life. They gave you your life. They dedicated their whole lives to you. The least you can do is take care of them. And now in reality, most people, when we think about it, probably didn't have a perfect childhood. So what is that belief defending, and why do outsiders cling to it so hard? Just that they gave their whole lives to you. You owe them this. It's the least you can do.
Well, it's part of the title of my book, The Status Quo. And that's the problem, is people say these things all the time. I travel in Eastern Europe a lot, and a lot of people will say, well, that's just how he is. And I say, that's not true about him. He's not an aggressive, mean person, or, this is how it is and that's it. And that's the end of the conversation, that there can be this aggression there. Or saying that, you only have one family and you have to show up for them and you have to be there for them. Parents are a vehicle by which children arrive, but that doesn't mean that that is going to be a relationship that sustains. If there's been trauma, and particularly messaging to the people who might be a possible scapegoat, the most powerful thing to do in many circumstances, and you work with a therapist and figure out if this is your case, is to move out of that family dynamic. And I say, move out of it until you can be there. There's a possibility you'll find the power within to know how to manage it, or to know how to change that for yourself so that that behavior stops. But until then, that's a massive vulnerability. And that's what the family doesn't want, is vulnerability. They don't ever want you to move out of fear, which we do that through vulnerability, and then we move into self-expression. they really don't want is for you to self-express. So they don't want to hear your boundary.
It's amazing. Caregiving can slowly just train people to ignore their inner signals, their true self, their needs, their limits, everything. I mean, it's all coming out here. They ignore their own truth. I mean, this is the model at work, right?
It is. And it's also a piece that has to do with caregiving, which makes it unique, is its crisis. And it's as though you're in a constant crisis for years and years, depending on what's happening with that person's health and their body and their mind. And you're operating at such a high level that the stress is imminent. It's constant.
I mean, the model didn't just start one day. It's a live, dynamic entity,
Right.
And there's probably some selectivity, right? There's probably some good in the model, some choices that have been made over centuries as the model has evolved. That that there is some goodness in some of that shaping, which we believe is important for society. How do we understand the positive and negative traits of the model?
Well, it's interesting you say that. I've never been asked that question, and I don't see any positive thing to the model. Nobody benefits from it. It purely is based on two forms of control. And those two forms of control continue to swing like a pendulum back and forth. And so we never stop. And that's why we feel like society is moving faster and faster, and we can't stop. We're more anxious. Kids that are 18 years old are more anxious than they have been since I read part of a book by Tamara Chansky. It's about anxiety, but in it she states something to the effect that kids that are 18 years old, this was quite a few years ago, let's say 2014 or so, are more anxious than people who were institutionalized for anxiety in the 1950s. And it was something like 80% of 18-year-olds are more anxious than these people that were institutionalized for it in the 1950s. So this is no surprise. This is the model clamping down on us, saying, what are you going to change? And really what I found in my first unfolding with what the model is was through parenting my children. I'm not going to go into it in great detail, but essentially, I could tell something was wrong within me. Something wasn't sitting right. And I went after it by watching other parents, looking at what my parents did. And then I said, I want to do not what my peers are doing, which they do the opposite or the same as what their parents did. And so it took me 2 years, and some parenting techniques came that kept this knowing alive in my kids. It was just pure luck or maybe kismet. But then what happened is after those 2 years, I broke out of this model, and it felt physically painful to me. It was a very strange experience. But when I broke out of it, what I realized is the power is in the middle. And we keep missing the power because we're on this pendulum swinging control to control. That's why we see politics are more polarized and all of this. So then when I looked at the power in that, a few years later into my parenting where I became really solid, people would come up to me and say, you're a magic parent. And I'd say, that's no magic. It was hard won. But I tell that because that's what happens outside of the model is it becomes so easy to do the thing. It became so easy to parent my children. The good tension of love was there and caring and seeing that they know best for themselves in every circumstance possible. And I'm there to only guide or coach when necessary, that I let them make the mistake and have the consequence, whether it's personal or the consequence comes from me.
Sometimes the consequence is the learning, and that's where the future power comes from, right?
Yeah. And in my work, I say in the model that really fuels the hierarchy, and the hierarchy asserts that some have no consequences, while others have far too high of a consequence. And those who have no consequences, gone unchecked, they're the very ones that set the tone for society. But because of no consequences, they've never fully matured. So in effect, we're living in a world that never matured from my perception and my work past the age of about 16 years old emotionally. And we're stuck there. And that's what I want to change.
So the model has that influence early on, but then I imagine it's alive in different forms or reshapes itself over the course of one's lifetime. But when one person gets conditioned to serve a family. Like, how does a caregiver get back in touch with what's truly unique and true to themselves and actually start building their life back, or at least showing up a little bit more as their true selves? I know it's not a switch or a black and white moment, but it's a process that needs to be initiated. But how do they start building their life back?
Yeah, well, the first piece is they won't know their needs, particularly in a dysfunctional situation, until they find safety. And often in my work, I recommend, particularly for a scapegoat, they step away from the dynamic, because it's very challenging to heal the dynamic when you're in it. Even if you're learning new tools, what I've found personally is when you've learned these new tools and you feel, I feel so much better, and then you're back at the dynamic that created this with you, that what you learned and the trauma ends up getting stuffed down further. Like you had it out, you had it up, you were dealing with it. And then you don't know what happened. All of a sudden, it's like the rug was pulled out from underneath you and you feel even worse. And this is why stepping away to take a break and do the healing. But first, you have to get at that nervous system and calm in order to be able to function and know what your needs are.
I've always been of the opinion that to deal with that sort of tension, sometimes we choose to give more, and giving actually becomes a currency. And I think that could even affect individuals' choices to enter medicine or allied health, where the giving actually becomes that currency to deal with the tension that arises. And as you say, until you step out and actually say, well, what do I need? There may not actually be space. And you actually unlearn that habit of identifying your needs and actually feeling empowered to choose one of your needs for a change.
Right. And I really don't even think people in this circumstance can choose their needs very easily. They have to first have that safety, because the emotional has to be addressed in order to say it's safe and okay to have a need. That's how most family dynamics leverage it, is you don't have any needs.
It's amazing. Caregiving for an elderly patient or ailing family member can just snap you back so quickly into these childhood patterns, or like recollections of walking on eggshells, keeping the peace,
Right.
Earning approval. Why does that happen so fast and so easily when the call to caregiving is heard?
Well, in part, I believe that, we tend to be caregiving for an ailing parent when we're in our 40s or 50s. And that's a point where the fractal patterning, and I'll describe that in a minute, is so built up. That's why people have a midlife crisis. So if that energy around it is so high up, and then we're caring for this parent and it's in our face, it's right there, we can't get away from it, it's going to create the cataclysm for us to realize we have to make choices and changes. And the fractal patterning is simply, say that you had an altercation with the person you're caring for when you were 6, then it's likely you had another situation, maybe not from that caregiver, but from somebody else out in society, a teacher at 12, and then at 18, and then at 24. And until we address that and stop the fractal patterning, that builds up. And that's why a midlife crisis tends to occur, is we get to 40 and 50 and we say, I can't hold on to this anymore. It's become too large.
Is that second adulthood, to quote James Hollis, and that moment reflect people's true attempt to let go of the model once and for all, so they, in their second or third or maybe fourth to last decades of life, they can re-embrace the knowing?
Yes, except for the people that it seems the system worked for, the people who could adhere to the model without too much challenge, they may never grow. And I look at that as the availability of that is that they hold the structure for society, while a whole host of people can change and shift into being outside of something like the model. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely evidence there of our later years. Even in astrology, there's the Chiron return for the wounded healer, or no, wounded warrior, I think is what it is, or, it's about healing yourself. And that hits between 50 and 53. Even in menopause, they're finding that women have a hormone that is discharged in their body until their children are a certain age, so that they keep the peace to protect the children. And once that's done, that women that are postmenopausal, they don't care. They'll say whatever they want because there's no risk of hurting the child. Interesting. All of those play
Fascinating.
into this concept, right?
Many caregivers describe a state of hypervigilance, almost dread and feeling on edge every day when caring for a controlling and critical parent. What happens to their nervous system in that environment?
Well, yeah, I'm not an expert on the nervous system, but if you're coming in not feeling safe already because there's history there and the history hasn't been solved where the parent is, or the person you're caring for isn't responsive to it and kind of trained with it, it's just making that nervous system, rev up even further, right? And there's a beauty in that because it gets us to the point where maybe we will go to therapy. Maybe we will go on that retreat and get help to recognize the difference between how wound up we are and what the regular set point would be for us. I think that
What's the tipping point we need to look for? I mean, we have listeners now who are sort of probably scratching their heads wondering, geez, have I felt that moment yet? Is it to come? Like what, from your experience working with clients, where does that tipping point, that realization moment, like what do you have to get to? Is it number of times you feel dismissed, a number of times you feel hurt? How do we know?
Well, I think one sign of it is we become highly emotional, overly emotional. And the reason that happens is we're at a place where those emotions are so overwhelming now because our nervous system is so wound up and we don't feel safe that we can't hide it or push it down or just endure. And so I'd say that's probably a breaking point of something has to really change quite soon. But that's the problem with this is I find a lot of people who are caregivers or the more sensitive types in the family can endure a lot. And they had to learn that to survive because the world was overstimulating. It was a lot to take in. And now that is not serving us. Probably 20 times ago, they should have said no. That was the breaking point. Or when the person became ill, here's who I can and can't be. Right? And I would rather have somebody say that to me so that I know and listen to the word I just used there so that I know. And then I can find somebody else who can fill in these other pieces. We need a massive system of people. We can't rely on one person. It's not realistic. It's not sustainable. You know that. Yeah.
I mean, caregivers are so often trained to normalize what shouldn't be normal, to just push through and stay quiet and keep functioning. I mean, can we pinpoint even first signs of when someone's not just tired, but they're truly entering that phase of complete self-abandonment?
Well, Mark, I'm going to say that nothing about the model is normal. That's why nothing about it is good or works. But to answer your question...
That sounds a bit nihilistic, though. I mean, I need to understand a little bit more. Nothing good. Is it not because of what the model has chosen, but rather just the concept of the model is the problem, because it doesn't let for self-realization. But not everything that the model stands for is inherently bad. But it's the process that the model functions by that is the problem.
But what happens is it degrades our ability to self-express so that we feel suffocated. So let's bring it back to the question, I think it's a perfect segue, is when people have tightness in their throat, when they go to caregive and they feel like, I don't want to do this, or they have tightness in their chest, or gut tightness, or some sense of like a stomach ache. These are signs. Headaches are another way that the stress is mounting. And look to the physical. They're also, I'm in the spiritual a bit, so I look up things such as what is the spiritual meaning of a headache or of a left foot or left ankle hurting. And often we can track it back because it will show emotional components and we can directly correlate that to the person we're giving the care. That makes sense. And go ahead. Our bodies are able to heal themselves. They're self-sustaining, but we're just learning how that's possible. And that moves into what is kind of quantum about us, but that's very human.
Very human and not very well learned and not very well taught.
Well,
That might
because
be.
it's not proven and science doesn't like that. But
Mhm.
when I've had so many experiences that prove it's true that I've learned to trust it. But that took me years because it's odd. I thought, am I just that creative? Am I just that lucky? But no, it's very powerful.
When someone realizes that what I'm going through is not okay, I have to change something, what's the smallest first choice that they can make that actually shifts the system in the family without waiting for everybody else to agree?
Setting their boundary in the sand and saying, you know what, I have been doing this for X amount of months and I've, that's been worked. And now this is what's going to work for me. And you are going to need to figure out the rest, or I can facilitate this part of that. But that they really set boundaries that hold like this. They talk to friends who have been caregivers. They talk to maybe a support group so that they understand the ins and outs. When we're essentially what we're doing is we're parenting other people in that moment, the caregiver is to their siblings or the support network. And they need to find if there are any holes in the boundary that they're setting. So, a quick one, if a teenager is out of control and they really weren't parented very well, the parent might call all of the friends' parents of the child and say, I need us all in on this. What are the holes in my plan? And that all the parents, maybe the teachers at school and the parents that are the parents of this child, come together and work through the plan, it will be flawless. And the child has no out and has to receive that consequence fully. And so this is how we need to think about it is what are the statements and what is the statement? Because that person may be weak to the situation with their siblings or the other caregiver group.
Mhm.
If the group says, well, you can't do that, they might say, okay, but they have to go through that process with their friends in that safe group of people to get the concepts nailed down. It also, being that they're in a stressful situation and their nervous system probably or could be very wound up, they might need to rehearse those lines. They might need to say it 3 times in the morning, and at 10 a.m., try not to read it and say it. And if they can't, they read it. And at noon, try and say it without reading it to really reinforce that they have the exact words they want to say and be succinct.
So, Amy, tell me, what's one of the biggest breaking points in caregiving when siblings just don't share the load and the people doing the least are often the ones with the biggest, loudest, clamoring voices and have the biggest opinions? I mean, how can siblings raised in the same home develop such wildly different moral stories about what they owe each other and what they owe their parents?
Well, it's the dynamic of the family has different roles that the children have to play. So one is the favorite child of the father, one's the favorite child of the mother, one's the scapegoat, and that dynamic will show a resurgence in times of stress. If a parent passes and they're reconciling the estate, that can get caught up for years because the siblings can't agree. And I have an interesting situation in my own family that I think is worth sharing. When my father was ill, we all agreed on everything. And what was interesting is for the care conferences or for like my father had a brain injury and he ended up getting out of the locked unit he was in for his own safety, and the people showed up to deal with that situation that were fierce but really cool under pressure. So the right people showed up in the right situations and it was magic. And so in a way, I looked at my father as healed because he was getting the best care he could. Now, we did play different roles to some degree, but for some reason, the level of enmeshment in my family had us seeing our family all the same way. It's very rare. But some families and some caregivers listening to this may have that experience where the family actually agrees and it works. But if there's not, we want to be aware of our role. And as I've said, the scapegoat role of people talking behind your back and saying, she or he's so bad or these made up things is toxic, too toxic. It's not a safe position to be in. But other roles, like the favored child who's there with their beautiful coiffed hair and they're saying how much they do for the person that needs the care. And we can say, is that true? we can call them out and see what happens, but there's probably not much likelihood of change unless we all go to therapy, unless we all get help where it's constructive. And there's a good mediator there to help us see our part. And that's probably really rare in a family that has a wild dynamic.
And it would probably take a long time to fix, but certainly perhaps a good investment for a family nevertheless. I mean, that's how change occurs. Change isn't easy. And it could also be viewed as a bit of a blessing if a family's successful at reprogramming the relationships in a way that makes them healthy moving forward. Families often excuse that sort of harmful behavior of the care recipient, saying they're old, they're scared, just let it go. You kind of alluded to that a little bit earlier about some cultural mentalities, but can a caregiver actually tell the difference between what's sort of stress-provoked and long-standing narcissistic patterns of entitlement, control, and cruelty in the loved one they're looking after?
Probably. And they also might be able to see the degradation of the parents. They are in more fear that they're ill or they're reacting as a child. And so they may see, boy, that conversation we just had sounded like I was talking to a 5-year-old. They might recognize some pieces, and they could look at that as it's a harbinger of the parent is regressing into that time when they were 5 and kind of reciting some trauma that they had. But on the whole, I think it's a tricky piece because the person who is caregiving, and that primary caregiver particularly, can be under so much stress that it's tricky to process things mentally and make sense of it. Everything is moving so fast. They have their regular life to maintain. And within that, they may be raising children. They may have their own things that they're taking care of, as well as a job and who knows what other things. And then trying to figure this out can be burdensome instead of possible. Also, to go back to the family dynamic, every sibling or every person involved needs to agree that they want to be a part of that. And most don't, particularly the person who's there saying, I do all of this and I'm so amazing. They don't want to heal because the story for them is, I'm perfect and amazing. Why would they want to change that perception? They wouldn't.
Do you think something you just mentioned sort of stirred a thought? But getting back to highly sensitive people and highly sensitive caregivers, we're hearing a lot about the sandwich generation these days. And do you think highly sensitive people who are caring in the sandwich generation are particularly vulnerable, or do you think they might be actually more resilient?
Well, I've never heard the term the sandwich generation. Can you say more about that?
So
Is it
you alluded to the individual caregiver who may have to look after their own children and then look after an aging parent and their own responsibilities, their own jobs, etc. So they're sort of sandwiched in this caregiving role from both ends.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And
how does that...
the attendant pressures of that form of caregiving seem to carry with them, I think, a state of overwhelm that can amplify quite significantly. And it's proving to be a challenging dynamic as the society's dynamics and aging populations and more caregivers. And the statistics in the States suggest that, more and more caregivers are taking on that dual role and assuming the caregiving requirements for elders in the family while trying to still run their own family's dynamic day-to-day life and challenges that come with it. And with that comes increased risks of caregiver burnout, caregiver exhaustion, and obviously depersonalization and all of the things that come with it.
Well,
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead. Sorry.
Well, in that context, it was making me think, like, if someone's highly sensitive, can they navigate that more easily, or are they more vulnerable to the impact, even for the same degree of background childhood trauma, let's say? I mean, I don't think there's a trauma-less childhood, right? And I mean, depends on your definition of trauma. Not having an extra cookie at dinner time is probably not qualifiable as trauma, although some might say, all trauma is trauma, but that's up for debate, I think.
Yeah, I think it depends on the dynamic. If the person has a track record of setting good boundaries that held, I think they're going to have an easier time. I also think it speaks to the age of their children. If they have children who are in their teenage years, I'll say it this way: parenting energy, the energy it takes to parent never changes. It's consistently, maybe the word would be intense. But once children are in the high school era, or to make it more universal, 13 to about 22, that is a time where children need a lot of emotional attention, and children are very emotional. And so if the parent is raising children in that time zone of ages, and then working with a parent or caregiving to somebody, I think it's going to stress them more, because a lot of the problem is stemming from that primary emotional situation for them. And that tends to be that's the age of our children when we're caring for parents, that they're going to be in that zone of age. So that's how I would speak to that.
So lots of potential for compounding there.
Yeah.
Family caregivers, get painted as the villain almost the moment that they set those limits. And we've spoken a bit so far about that. Can you give us one sentence a caregiver could use and say that it's firm and not cruel, but so they could actually feel good in the moment afterwards, even if the family reacts badly?
Yeah, I think that the best thing to say is what their need is, in the way of, because I can't decide or figure out what their need might be, but it might be, I'm only able to care for mom on Tuesdays going forward. And when the family starts to say, and this is the important part, that's not fair, or you can't do that. Why are you doing that? The person's response can be, I can't say. And what's the reason that works is it's true. They don't know why they're doing that, but they know inside they need to. And so the people tend not to buck that. And if they do, the person can say to them, when the person asks again, why can't you do this? Or this is ridiculous or whatnot, I can't say. If you say it twice, they tend to back off. And it's because energetically what you're saying is, I don't know. And because you don't have anything to prove, and you're not posturing in this model and being, in a sense, controlling, they can't resist it. And that's how you are. They might say something snide or crummy, but you got to let that go. So that's a key statement. The other thing is to say to yourself behind the scenes, with the crummy thing they say at the end, so what? When you get in the car and you're ruminating, you say to yourself, so what? And you know what? The first time you do it, you might have to say it 1,000,000 times on that car ride home. But we process through, so what that happened? So what that mom got the wrong medication today? Everything's going to be okay. So what? It's a day of painfulness for her. It'll be okay tomorrow. We have to learn to let go. We can't make everything perfect for somebody who is ill. That's their experience.
Building on that, a lot of caregivers, despite awareness of strategies and techniques, just can't go low contact because a parent needs constant care, and maybe in certain situations there really is no one else. What can the caregiver do in those high contact situations where there are no alternatives to defend themselves against the old patterns of control and manipulation?
Well, this is hard because it's asking them to do more before they can have something change. But I would look to all of the programs that are in your area and, can this company bus situation that's afforded by the community come and pick that parent up and bring them to their appointment? Are there channels or ways that the parent can have an online conference call? What are the ways that make this more streamlined and easier for you, so that there's less attention that you have to pay to all the details? Can you have a friend or a friend of the parent who gets involved to go and listen at the care conferences so you have a second pair of ears to hear all the information, particularly if you're stressed. It's very hard to take in all of the medications and the ways that everything works. Can you have a care nurse come in? Is that afforded by the healthcare plan? Or is the parent ready to be in an interim care facility? Or what are the options there? And to be proactive so that if you see, and you're going to know that the parent is failing, something's changing, your intuition is going to be there because you're close to this person, that you start getting, onto lists of where the parent could go in the event that they're too ill to be able to care for in home or whatever the scenario is. That's what I think is look at your resources and don't be afraid to use them. Ask the friends of the parent, can you come and help? Can you sit with my mom for an hour this afternoon while I run errands? Or, the situations are going to be diverse and different, but how do we get that support? I know in the community where I'm from, there were programs where somebody could come and sit with an ailing person for 4 hours, and they were screened and trained to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a little bus that would come and take the person to the doctor's office and help them into the building. And it was safe and secure, and it was really low cost because it was subsidized. But there are options. And in truth, what we want to do is allow that person who is ill to have as much autonomy as possible. And that might make the person who's ill afraid, like, why can't you be there for me all the time? But in the other respect, if it's filling you to have more energy for that person to share with them in their life and in the moments that are quiet, you can point that out to them. This gives me more time to sit with you and hold your hand when you're back at home. It gives me time to sit and make a puzzle with you or whatever they love to do, to paint the picture that this is the opportunity within it. And they can be angry, but you just need to go with it. Like I say with my kids, I parented them so that they had as much autonomy as possible, and I let them make their own mistakes and figure things out as much as they could. But when I'd say to them, this is how this is going to go, they'd listen because I rarely said that. They really heeded it. They were like, okay, Mom, right? There wasn't resistance because I wasn't constantly controlling them and saying, this is how, now do this, now do that. There was more of a freedom in it.
There's something empowering about making that first choice. And I think a lot of caregivers find themselves just unable to make that first step to reorganize the approach, especially when they're sole caregivers. And more importantly, those freed up hours actually may allow them to go to their own doctor's appointments for once. The one appointment that's been postponed and delayed perhaps 6 months, perhaps a year.
Right.
And we all know how much self-care can be hindered by the call to caregiving. But that notion of building the network and actually recognizing and I think reshifting your mental framework as a caregiver that this is holistic, this is a good thing. And we've always heard it takes a village, right? Well, it takes a village at different stages in our lives. And I think there's, one perfect example of, building the village or building the infrastructure to allow you as an individual to caregive in the most healthy way possible. And I think you really illustrate that really nicely. How do we not become enabling? Is it just boundaries? Is it firmness? What is there a strategy here?
There is, but it's complex and it's so stupidly simple. It seems mind-boggling to apply it in every situation so that we really clinch it and get it. But the reality is, as an enabler, we are also controlling things. And we don't tend to own that.
Let me think about that.
Yeah, go ahead.
So how are we controlling things as an enabler?
Well, so an enabler tends to have these attributes that they posture, where they posture in the model. It tends to be worry and guilt, drama, and withholding through self-abuse. So we talked about the withholding through self-abuse, which is ruminating when you leave the event, or overthinking, or churning it around, churning. But the worry is a big one, which is it states energetically, I don't think you can. So if we think of the first time our young 16-year-old or whatever age got their driver's license and they dropped us at home and they're going to take the car and leave. If the parent worries about them or thinks, uh-oh, what's going to happen? They're causing that energy to be, I don't believe in you. I don't think you can. And if the child has to make a snap decision, the chances are they will fail it because they have this energy on their back of, I don't believe in you. Whereas a parent who addresses themselves behind the scenes to get to where they believe in the child, that child in the snap decision moment is more likely to perform well and know what to do. They'll be with their knowing. So these are big pieces, is having people that believe in us. But then guilt is worthless. It's a useless situation where we say either you or I or both of us are not right. Like, we need fixing. Something's wrong here. We're not going to do it right. We see it in things like, take your coat, Jimmy. Well, you know what? If Jimmy doesn't take the coat and Jimmy's cold, Jimmy's going to learn next time to take the coat. And these consequences help us understand, oh, that's a bummer. I'm sure you are cold. Yeah. Right? And parents don't let children freeze or let any of that happen. But we need to be aware of, particularly like with the highly sensitive child, they tend to notice things at 5 to 7 years old and then 8 and 9, and they see the structures that are coming. And if we can get ahead of that with them and help them at home understand those structures, they have a much easier relationship with education and with the social structure in school. But we tend not to do that. We tend not to be proactive. So then I'll mention drama. We talked about it a little bit before. That's where somebody uses perhaps false information that is amplified to try and get attention. So it's, well, I just got mom's test results and one of them is very high. And when we go and we actually look at it, it's not any higher than it's been. But that person wasn't engaged and didn't know that. So they're making all of this story up to try and make it seem like, look at me, I'm hurting. But really what's going on underneath all of it in all of these circumstances is I have needs that have gone unmet. And I worry about you because actually I'm worried about me. And that's why we have to deal with ourselves behind the scenes. Yeah.
So to take those very powerful examples from teenagehood and childhood as a parent, when we're now a caregiver of our parent, how do we translate that skill set into the caregiving moment where we have a decision to make or an opinion to state that's actually perhaps received with difficulty, but in the moment, in the best interest of the care recipient?
Well, it's the sandwich generation that you're talking about. One of the unfortunate things about people that are in Generation X is we likely parented our parents, and then we grew up and we parented children, and now we're finding we need to parent ourselves. And it's mind-boggling. How do we get through all of this life without ever being parented and not parenting? Now we have to parent ourselves. What is that? So in effect, what we can do is look at it as parenting our parent. Well, Mom, this is what's going to have to happen. We're calling the shots to some degree in certain circumstances. Or what do you want to do about this? Okay, it sounds like you're not deciding. These are the two options. Do you want the Red Sox, the Blue Sox, but it's going to be higher level? Do you want this therapy or that? We're simply treating them like they're a child that we're parenting to help them come through and bring in the most powerful decision and choice for them. The truth of it is, if the parent, the patient is under a lot of stress, their likelihood of being able to make choices is going to be low. And that's where some of the burden is. We're making choices for a situation that's not ours. That's a bit unfair. It's a bit mind-boggling. And some people are really good at that, but there's not any autonomy there, and that's part of what makes it really stressful.
And I think recognizing that when the patient's under so much stress, some of their executive function's compromised. I think there are some studies that have looked at brain imaging, and under such chronic and or acute stress, executive function or blood flow to the areas of the brain that's involved in executive decision making is actually reduced. And that may have some impact on those abilities. So understanding that may actually sort of make a caregiver sort of feel, okay, well, maybe I do need to step in this way. But what does emotional detachment look like without cruelty in those scenarios? Like you allude to, well, Mom, you need to make this decision or that decision. Um, we need to be able to process that as a caregiver. We need to step back a little bit and detach, but how do we not feel like we're just being cruel in the moment?
Well, we don't have to be mean about it. It doesn't have to be crass, but just
Mm-hmm.
straightforward, deliver the information and see if they're willing to make a choice. I do think from parenting to this, we have to be forthright about it. We can't also say, well, what would you like to do? Because they're likely to say, I don't know, versus, Mom, would you like the red socks or the green socks or whatever it is, this therapy or that therapy? When we give them a choice, it narrows the parameters and makes it easier for them to make a choice. And the parent might be in a situation where they can't hear all of the pros and cons. And so it may be if they say, okay, I want this one, that sounds like a good choice because of XYZ, and we reinforce that with them. Or, you know what, I'm thinking maybe this other one is a good choice. We help shepherd them into the decision. But if they're resistant, they're going to have a hard time. Both parties will have a hard time. So if we can ease in, but be forthright, this decision needs to be made. And here are the two choices, and not overwhelm the patient. Yeah.
I think being forthright and loving can find that unique blend in those moments and make things feel just. When big phases of caregiving come to an end with either transitions to long-term care, hospice, or even death, the family system often reshapes overnight. When that old model breaks, how does the caregiver rebuild the life that's theirs again?
Yeah, well, it takes some rest, I think, first to get back to some sense of square one of, rest and actual sleep and getting back to who they are. But I also feel if there's been a lot of trauma in their past, it's, therapy or some sort of an option where they have support, a support group, something where they can return to themselves and have that. I mean, even this, I would say to my clients a lot of years ago, never sit in fear alone until you can. And if you call me at 2 a.m, it's possible I'll be up and I'll pick up the phone. It's not likely, but if you leave a message, I'll contact you as soon as I'm able. And you know what? Nobody ever called, but those clients kept coming back and back. And the reason they did is I left a placeholder for them that I'm available for them. And in the middle of the night when they were up, they'd think, I can call Amy, she's there for me, but I respect her and I won't disturb her life. But I know she's there. And that's a lot of us needed that as children, that we didn't have a parent who we knew was there. We were afraid to go in the middle of the night when we wet the bed or we were scared or had a problem. We were unsure if we should do that, right? So we're reconciling these long-held patterns, and we need support to see our way through and out. I mean, some of that is my work, is supporting how do we move free of the model, this system that isn't serving anyone. Yeah.
So with this big transition in a caregiver's life, is that a period of vulnerability in the model where we have the best chance of a rebirth into our own knowing?
I think it is an opportunity for it. I don't think it's the best opportunity. I think a lot of opportunities are available to come through. But I think in today's era, we're ready to let the model fall. And it's on time to talk about this. So in the other sense, yeah, that's a great opportunity if you're a caregiver to say, I'm not going to perpetuate this with my children. And I've noticed until children are about 30 years old, we can change the pattern and they will come along with us and change it themselves. And that's important. We can think of it that way. I'm doing this so that it changes things for my children. And while we may never reconcile it with that parent, we also will acknowledge at some point that parent played an incredible role and they were an incredible teacher to move us into a state of fully expressing ourselves because the contraction was so fierce. Now we want it so badly, we'll go through the pain that it takes to find our way through.
It sounds like a pretty important opportunity to put a break in the energy of generational trauma that sort of flows through the model.
Yep.
Thank you for being here today. What an amazing discussion and shedding light on so many important elements that contribute to the caregiving experience. And the wealth of knowledge you've shared with us today is really unique and compelling. And I'd like to thank you for being here. Where can people follow your work, and how can they learn more about your contributions? We're going to obviously put the link to your book called No in the show notes. When is your next book coming out?
Well, I already wrote it when I was writing the first book. But Mark, first, let me say thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed our conversation as well. And I think the best place is at my website, which is just my name, Amy Vasterling, which is should be on this information that I've sent you, so you'll be able to share a link, but just amyvasterling.com. And I'm on YouTube and on LinkedIn and so on, so I can be found many places. But my book is called No, K-N-O-W, and then it's where the status quo ends and you come to life. There it is.
It's a great read.
Yeah. Yeah, it is a quick and easy. I wrote it for the positioning of a handhold to say, this is where we are and this is what's going on. And the feedback I received was people could apply it to their unique life. And most of the people said to me, you said exactly what I could feel, but I couldn't articulate for myself. And I thought then the job was done. And my next book, I don't know when it will come out, but because that one just came out in September of 2025, but I've written it from the position of narcissistic social disordering. And I'm going to talk a lot about disordering and how we look at that from a very different angle in our world and what that means and how the model has impacted that to become something perhaps it's not. Yeah.
I look forward to reading it.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks for joining us from overseas today. We appreciate your contribution and we hope to have you back.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me.
That wraps up this week's episode of the Caregivers Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Mark. We look forward to seeing you back next week for another interesting discussion with our upcoming guest. If this conversation gave you language for something you've been carrying alone, you're not alone. You're not wrong for needing limits. Amy, thank you for being here. I so look forward to reading your next book. See you next time. Before we wrap up, I wanted to remind you of something important. The conversations you hear on this podcast are here to inform, to support, to spark reflection. They're not a substitute for professional medical advice, care, therapy, or crisis services. Listening to this podcast does not create a doctor-patient or caregiver-client relationship between us. If you're facing a medical concern, health challenge, a mental health challenge, or a caregiving situation that needs guidance, I encourage you to reach out to a qualified professional who knows your story. If you're ever in crisis, please don't wait. Call your local emergency number or recognize crisis hotline right away. You deserve real-time help and support. The views you hear on this show, whether from me or my guests, are our own. They don't necessarily reflect any organizations we work with, or are part of, or have worked with, or been part of in the past. This podcast is an independent production. It's not tied to any hospital, university, or healthcare system. Thank you for being here, for listening, and most of all, for taking the time to care for yourself while you continue to care for others. I look forward to hearing from you.